Pagination means displaying results in a multiple page format. If you look at the browser on the right, I have a page of 6 users, but that's not all of the results. If I click on the number 2, I can view the second page of results and I have another 6 users. Likewise, I can also click the arrows to go to the beginning of the results or these other arrows to go to the end of the results. Let's look at how all of this works in React. Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we're applying pagination to query results in React. I'll provide links to example source code and all resources in the description below. Let's get started today by looking at the package.json. Hopefully you've used Create React App to start your own project, or you can download my source code from the resources in the description of the video. So I'm going to press Ctrl B so we can see the code a little better by hiding the file tree. And you can see under my dependencies in the package.json, I'm also using Axios. And then in the second example today, I'm also going to use React Query. So I have both of those installed. If you don't have those right now, you'll want to type npm I in a terminal window like I am, and then type Axios, and then on the same line you could also use React Query, just like that. And to open a terminal window, I always press Control and backtick. Now I'm not going to press enter, but you should. I've already got them installed. So with that said, I'm going to close this. We'll go back to the file tree. And this is a tutorial where I'm not going to type out exactly everything that you see. I'm actually just going to go over it with you. Some viewers like it when I do that and go a little faster. Some like it when I type everything. Today, I'm going to go just a little faster. If you're a beginner in React, I think you can follow along, but if not, feel free to slow down or just follow example 1. That's going to be a little easier than example 2. So in the app component, you can see we're first going to look at example 1. Now this page that I showed in the intro is example 2. So we will come back to that. But let's first go back to the file tree and note that I've created an API folder inside of the source folder in our React app. And inside of this API folder, I've created an Axios.js file. Control B to hide that again, and let me just drag this over. So right now we're going to just look at code and we can see what all I have in here. So I'm importing Axios from Axios at the top. You can ignore these bottom two, they're for the second example. But for the first example, I'm creating an Axios instance called Axios1, or the first example, and then I'm creating a function called getPostsPage. The Axios instance just sets a base URL so we don't constantly have to refer to this long URL that is the URL of the fake API that we're using in the first example, jasonplaceholder.typicode.com. Now inside of the getPostsPage function, we're passing in a page parameter, and if it doesn't get passed in, it defaults to 1. And then we go ahead and make our request with that Axios1 instance. It's a GET request, and this is a template literal. This API supports sending page parameters. So instead of just requesting the post as we see here, then we have a question mark and underscore page, which is the page parameter for this specific API, and then we set it equal to the page param that is passed in. And we return that response.data. So now let's go back to the file tree and see how these are used in example 1. Example 1 is an example of pagination that is only using React hooks. It's not using React Query or any third-party library. And it's also an example of working with an API that allows pagination so we can request specific pages, but it doesn't give us any extra data. It doesn't tell us how many pages there are, how many results that will be in the total, the sum total of all of the requests or anything like that. So it doesn't really give us any of that extra data that we would like to have, and we'll look at how an API responds with extra data in example 2. But in this first example, we're bringing in getPostPage, we're bringing in useState and useEffect, and we're bringing in a post component. Let's quickly look at this post component, and you can see it just receives an individual post, and it's got an article here that displays the post title, the post body, and the post ID. Very simple component to display each post. Oh, now we're back at Axios. We want example 1. There we go. So then in example 1, we have page and set page, and it starts out with a value of 1 in state, posts and set posts with an empty array. And then we use effect. And yes, this is React 18, but strict mode calling useEffect twice in the beginning will not make a difference here. This is okay. We don't need that get post page there. I can remove that actually. But what we do want is to call the get post page function that we import from Axios, and then we pass in the page that we're holding in state, and then we get the JSON back and we set post to that JSON data. So all we really need in the useEffect dependency is the page value. Then we're creating content as well. And then we map over the post. This content will be our JSX content. So then we map over that post data, and then for each individual post, we create a post component like we've imported. We need a key, so that's the post ID, and then we pass in the post object, and that is what is displayed then inside of each post component. Notice we also have two functions, next page and previous page. These functions just both call set page, but next page uses the previous state plus 1, and previous page uses the previous state minus 1. So very simple. And then we have a fragment here in our JSX with a nav component. That nav component has two buttons. So we have a button with an on-click that calls previous page, and then we also have a button that calls the next page function. Notice the disabled here. So this would be true if the page equals 1, because there would be no previous page before 1. Likewise, even though we don't know the total number of pages or posts that will be displayed from the API data that we receive, we will know when we get an empty array once again. So if we get to a page that has no results, we don't want to be able to go any further. So then we disable the next page button. And of course down here we display the content that is defined, which would be all of the posts. So that basically covers example 1. I'll pull this back to the left, and I'm going to go ahead, press Control in the backtick, type npm start, and this should start example 1, and I'll go ahead and close out of the previous example that we were looking at. Oh, it says it's running on another port because of that previous example. I'll quickly close that out from my example that we had before. I'll say no, and then we'll just start it once again. And now we should be able to see it start up here in a new tab over here in the browser. And so here's example 1. So you can see we have a page of 10 posts that we have received from our API. There's all the way down to post ID number 10. Our previous button doesn't work because we're on page 1, but if we want to go to the next page, we can easily do so. So there's post 11 through, at the bottom, post 20. Now this will continue, I believe. We have 100 posts. So once we get to the end, we have a blank page, and next page, that button no longer works. Previous page works just fine. And of course, they both work in between until we get back to the first page, and then the previous page button doesn't work. So this is a basic example. We only used React hooks to do this, so no third party. And the API didn't give us a whole lot of data. It accepted a request for a page, but it didn't give us any other data that we may need to create a better experience. So now let's look at example 2, where we can provide a better experience, and we'll get a little more information from the API as well. Okay, I'll go back to the file tree, and then inside of the app.js, I'm just going to swap this out. Of course, you'll always get a warning that you're not using the other component that you have imported, but I'm just swapping out example 1 for example 2 here inside of the app.js. After I save, we get Example2 now showing in the browser. Now clearly, instead of posts, these are users, so we're getting some different data back. And likewise, we have a user component here. I will hide the file tree again so we can see most of this. And it is just like the post component. We pass in that user object and we're getting all of the different properties from it and displaying them inside of this component. Once again, an article element here. Other than that, let's go ahead and look at the API where we're getting these results, because we're getting more than just the user data. We're getting some other very useful data. So let me see if I can enlarge this even, and then I'll pull this over to full screen that we can look at this a little bit better. But there we go. So we're also getting page 1, and then how many results are on a page per page, and that value is 6. The total results, that value is 12, and then the total pages, and that value is 2. And then we get our data. So instead of just referring to the JSON data and thinking it is all of the data as we did with posts, here we'll have users. If we call all of the data users, for example, we'll have users.data to get the actual data that is inside of it. So that kind of explains what we're looking at, and we can use this extra information here that I listed at the top to provide a better experience in our page. So now let's go back, and I'll drag this over. We'll show the example once again, and now let's look at the code for example 2, and I'll drag this back to full page. Now we're going to import the useQuery hook from React Query, and I'll go over that in just a second. We're also going to import getUsersPage back from our Axios file. So let's look at this Axios.js again and see what we're doing here. So now I have a second Axios instance that I called Axios2 because it has a different base URL. So here's the base URL, and then the getUsersPage function is much like we had for the getPostPage function before. It accepts that page parameter, but now we have to construct it the way this second API wants the URL constructed. So this is /users ? Notice there's no underscore here because this API doesn't have that. It just says page, not underscore page, equals, and we pass the page parameter. And then we return the data that we receive that once again has that extra data in it. So now I'll close the Axios.js file, and here inside of the example2 file, we're looking at importing useState, but not useEffect now, because we're going to use React Query and this useQuery hook instead. We're also going to import that user component we looked at, and we have page buttons, and those are those navigation buttons that I was just showing at the top of the page. So we'll also be able to look at those, and we'll probably do that last because we want to compare the rest first. And the first example didn't really have those. It just had a next page and previous page button. So in this example 2, we're once again using state, page, and set page, and starting that state value out at 1. But then we use the useQuery hook from React Query. It provides several useful things. It has an isLoading state, an isError if an error exists, and then we can get the error object and find out what that is. We're going to get the data from this useQuery hook, and then I renamed the data users because it would get very confusing, I think, if I left it as data and then there was a data property inside. So then we would be at like data.data. We don't want that. So we'll have users.data. And then there's also an isFetching status, an isPreviousData status, which is a Boolean, that is a true or false. And then here, when we call useQuery, we have to identify the query first. And since it's for a specific page, we provide this array here that not only gives the endpoint users, but then says exactly which page this is. And that's how React Query caches and tracks these results for this individual page. So it will cache the different results for the different pages. And then we have a function afterwards, and this is where we call our getUsersPage inside of useQuery. And this is what we imported from Axios. We pass in the page state that we have here from our useState, and then we have one option here, and this is keepPreviousData. And that is set to true. Now I'll drag this over to the left, and let's quickly look at what keepPreviousData means inside of React Query. So what it is saying is everything works fine the way it is. However, if we didn't have that, the UI would jump in and out of success and loading states as different queries are created and destroyed for each page. So by setting keepPreviousData to true, we get a few new things. The data from the last successful fetch is available while the new data is being requested, even though the query key changes. And then when the new data arrives, the previous data is seamlessly swapped to show the new data. And then remember, we have isPreviousData over here as well. isPreviousData is made available to know what data the query is currently providing you. So that means if isPreviousData is true, we're looking at old data while the new data is being requested. So that explains what's going on there with React Query and why we're setting keepPreviousData to true. So now let's look at how we would render these results. If isLoading is true, we're just going to return loading users. And that could be a spinner as well if you had a spinner component or something else to display. We'll just have this basic loading users. If error is true, we're going to return a paragraph here that has the error, and then it's going to say what the error message is. Other than that, we're going to once again create content to display inside of the JSX. Notice now we have our users, and then we have to say data.data before we map over it. And that's because that's where all of the user data was, but we're also getting those other things from users like the total pages, for example. So once we say users.data.map, we can map over each user. And then, of course, we pass in that data. I'll hide the file tree just to see the extra here. Then we pass that data in to the user component. And then we have the key, once again, as the user.id, but then the user component receives the full user object. Next page and previous page are just like the first example with the previous state +1 and previous state -1 set according to those functions. But then we have something new here, and this is new because we want to create that menu that gives us the page numbers at the top. So we create a pages array, and we can do that by creating a new array based on that total pages value, so users.totalPages. And then on this array, I'm calling fill, and then I'm mapping over it, and I'm ignoring what we would typically use as the first parameter in map, but I'm using the index. And remember, it would start at 0, so I'm saying index +1, so it starts at 1 and moves its way up. So if there are 10 total pages, then we would map over this and have 10 created here as well. What I want is an array of numbers to equal how many buttons we want for pages to push. So I get that array created right here. That's the pages array. And then when we get to our nav that I'm creating here, and I am applying a class just so it's styled differently for the second example. And actually, I believe this should be class name, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to, of course, apply that correctly. But after that, we have our button for the previous page and button for the next page. But in between, we map over this pages array and create however many page buttons we need. Now we're passing in 3 different things to the page button. So we'll look at that component next. But the key is the page. So the PG just represents page. I named it differently so it did not get confused with our page state as well, because now we're mapping over the numbers of all the different pages from the pages array. So we're passing in the key of page, and then of course page equals page, so the component gets it, because here we just need the key separately. Set page is the set page function, and then that isPreviousData Boolean. We also need that for each one of these buttons as well. So now let's look at that component real quickly before we finish this out. Let's look at that page button component. It's fairly short and simple, but you can see we're receiving the page, set page, and isPreviousData. And then it returns a button. Well, the onClick calls the set page and passes in the page value. So whatever the number of the button is, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then disabled. The button is disabled if isPreviousData is true, and that means because a fetch is currently happening. So what is happening is that data is stale. We don't want to be constantly clicking the button, so we're going to just disable it if that is true. And then we're going to display the page number on the button. And that's all there is to that component. So I'll close that back. We're back to example 2, and now we're ready for the JSX. So we have a fragment again. We display the nav that we created above. We also display the content, and then just because we can, going to display if isFetching is true, we're going to display a quick little isLoading, but it's kind of flashy and I don't know that I would leave it. I just want to show that's possible based on the isFetching status. So with that said, now let's drag this back and let's look at how all of this works once we're back to our example. So here we've got our 6 users, and that's what's expected there. And now these were the buttons that were created. So you can style these with CSS how you would want them. I have just got a flexbox here that had brought all the different buttons together essentially. And then if I click on any one of the specific numbers, they get a different color. There's like number 2, number 1, and so on. We can also go to the end because that just went to the end with number 2 right there. What we would need to do is calculate that a little differently if we had more pages than 2. And of course, going back to the beginning would be the same as well. So we could set that to always go to 1, for example, if we did that. But these currently work because we only have 2 pages. But let's go ahead and look at those functions just to see what we might want to adjust if we had more than 2 pages. Let's call our previous page function, I'll press Control D to select both instances. Let's call it a first page function. And then we're just going to set the page to 1. So it would always take us back to 1 no matter what page we're on. And then likewise, let's call our next page function, I'll Control D to select both instances there, a last page function. And here we can use that same value that we were actually using before, and we used that to create our array here, users total pages. So whatever the total pages is, we can just put this back in, and that will take us to the end because it will be the last page. So now let's drag this back and see if our buttons are still working as expected. So the button on the right took us to the last page. The button on the left took us to the first page. And so yes, everything is showing as we expect it to, and still the buttons on the left and the right are working. Overall, I hope this has helped you learn more about how you can create pagination in your pages, and of course the information that you would like to get from the API, whether you're the one making the back-end API or someone else is. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.